How's it going, everyone? And welcome back. So now that both the Arkham and Marvel marathons are all wrapped up, I think it's time we slow things down a little and go back and forth between some games related to both Marvel and DC Comics. I have the next big marathon planned, but I need a little bit of time to prepare for that, so why don't we just shine the limelight on some other heroes and teams? With that said, it seemed appropriate that for this video we focused on the Man of Steel himself. But first, I'm going to show off my new intro that'll be in every game review going forward. So, without further ado, please enjoy. Oh, Superman, what a bumpy ride in the interactive space it has been for you. Well, with another movie on the horizon, the fine folks over at EA decided to take a crack at it, and in their infinite wisdom, they assigned the project over to the Tiburon team who made the Madden games at the time. Eventually, the game would release around the same time as the movie was released for DVD, and the critics absolutely destroyed it. Which is right. I don't have a lot of memories with this game particularly, but if there's one thing I do remember is playing it while we were on a trip to see family. We really didn't get into it much and ended up playing Bionicle Heroes instead. Yeah. For this video I'm looking at the 360 version because it's the one I own and it's better than the PlayStation 2 version by default. Well then, it's time for me to make my grand return to superhero game reviews and begin with the story. No story for this video since it follows the movie's plot, but it's very loose with it. Most of your time will be spent dealing with other shit like fighting Metallo, stopping Mongol, and wondering why Bizarro is here. It's so weird how disjointed this story is, and it makes you wonder why they were forced to put the film's events in here. They did manage to get some movie cast members like Brandon Routh, Kate Bosworth, which... sure? And Kevin Spacey, who is of course the best Lex Luthor. WRONG! Damn. Well, still better than Eisenberg. Like most movie actors, they sound bored to tears and wish they were anywhere else other than that booth. Even Kevin is really subdued considering how over the top he was in the movie. Well, that was disappointing. Now on the gameplay. Let's begin with combat, shall we? You only have one button to attack enemies, with that being the X button. You can perform combos as well, whether it be the standard 3-hit chain or a wide selection that incorporates other buttons and the occasional trigger. Personally, I find the whole combat system to be a detriment just because of how finicky it is. There's one combo I use for just about everything, and even that can be a pain to pull off since the other button it uses makes you fly. Speaking of other buttons, the A button allows you to pick up objects like cars and such, while the B button makes you block enemies and projectiles, and I rarely use both of these. It's mainly bosses where I get the most out of them, but I will say the block is easily more helpful and it does its job relatively well. For flight we have the Y button. Just tapping it will slightly lift him off the ground, but by holding the button it launches the Man of Steel sky high. Doing the same thing in the air will either slightly descend you to the ground or cause you to make a fucking crater.
Superhero landing!
Flight is actually really fun in this game. It controls well enough, and the added speeds you can achieve by holding the right bumper makes heading to destinations and just messing around less of a chore. There's just something about it that I never get tired of, and it's probably my favorite part of the game. The only thing that sucks about being in the air is punching enemies. It's incredibly awkward, and you're better off just ramming into shit with your head. Lastly, let's talk about the powers you'll be using during your adventure. With the press of the D-pad, you can activate 3 abilities which include Heat Vision, Freeze Breath, and the power to blow.
The fuck you say?
Just gonna say that Heat Vision is gonna be your best friend for a majority of the game. Freeze Breath really helps for certain situations, and Breath I find only useful for putting out fires. What also helps is the lock-on that you'll be using for every battle. Each power also has a burst ability you can unlock, and I never use these whatsoever. Overall, gameplay is relatively solid. It's not great enough to praise, but it's not shitty enough to riff on. Time to go on to the other stuff in the game. First we have the open world, which is a massive utopia, and honestly, it's a bit too massive. Thanks to the speed boost, it helps getting across the city, but it's still crazy how huge it is, and it can be a bit overwhelming at times. Another problem I find is that there's way too many buildings, and when you're in the middle of a fight, you will most likely be crashing into a wall. I almost forgot to mention that the city has a life bar, which is a neat idea and concept, but it becomes a hassle especially later in the game. Speaking of which, enemies in this game are nothing really noteworthy. You'll face a range of threats including robots, aliens, clones, and douchebags. During the latter half of the game, they introduce monsters that don't react to your powers, and some asshole who clones himself, which can be a pain, but for the most part they're insignificant. While we're at it, bosses are a joke. They're just a slightly beefed up version of a regular enemy. Sometimes they change it up a bit, like with the giant Metallo or a tornado.
Wrong!
You said it, Lex. Other than those, every boss fight is just lame, and the developer should feel bad for making them lame. Let's take a second to talk about how upgrades and story progression works. Every chapter has a certain amount of missions before moving on and nabbing a new upgrade. You can usually tell how close you are to finishing the chapter just by paying attention to your XP meter. As the game continues, the point value increases of course, but the main problem is the repetition of the missions. You're just fighting groups of enemies over and over and over again, with the occasional burning building every once in a blue moon. Combined with the bullshit enemy types near the end of the campaign, you're just gonna watch Metropolis's health decrease more often than you should. The game up until the last hour is pretty comfortable in terms of challenge, but after that it just becomes an absolute slog until the credits roll. This is easily the worst part of the game, and I'm so baffled on why they decided to structure it like this. In terms of upgrades, it's just more combos and an increase to your bursts, and I just don't care. Alright, I gotta move on before I go crazy thinking about this more. Music is so stock and forgettable. It's not bad, but not one track stands out to me, and it just ends up sounding like background noise. Graphics aren't that pretty to look at either. Not to mention the frame rate is absolutely shit, especially during large-scale events. When it comes to optional stuff in the open world, there isn't really much to go over. First up we have the challenges presented by Mr. Mitsapitlik, which can range from flight courses to a minigame where you transform into Bizarro and destroy as much as possible. They're kinda neat, but the strict time limits and weird design don't really tickle my fancy. Thankfully there aren't any rings. Besides that, there's cats scattered all over the map. 100 to be exact. I get that Superman saves kittens from trees, but this is just plain ridiculous. As far as unlockables go, they're okay for the most part. There's in-game achievements, which I don't care for, but the standouts are the alternate costumes and playable Bizarro. For costumes, we have the pod suit and the Golden Age outfit. The pod suit is cool, and I find the Golden Age costume to be an interesting pick. As for Bizarro, he's fun for a few minutes, but he loses his luster pretty quickly. You know, I think that covers just about all of it. On to my final thoughts. Superman Returns is a game that is constantly in a struggle with itself. I like the gameplay for the most part, but I don't enjoy the overall structure of the campaign. The open world is fun to travel through, but the things that do in it don't really interest me much. Certain unlockables are a neat bonus, but I'm more compelled to just use G-codes instead of playing the actual game, etc, etc. It's not a good game by any means, but it's something I can mess around with for a bit and find some enjoyment out of. Even with that, I still wouldn't recommend this game to anybody, because despite it not being the worst game in the world, it's still bad and just another example of the licensed movie tie-in garbage. Leave the game on the shelf on the used game store and invest in something worthwhile. Man, it feels strange doing one of these reviews and having it not be part of a marathon. Oh yeah, hey, look at this. I'm not shrouded in fucking darkness for once. Yeah, I got a ring light as part of my video reviews now, so now you can actually see my face. For my next video, however, actually, I'm not even sure what to do next, honestly. Guess I didn't really think this whole solo vid thing through. Until I figure it out, I hope you all have a great night. Thank you all so much for watching, and take care of yourselves.